and all our musicians I appreciate so much. All right, let's see. Today the sermon is entitled Holy Moses, and I noticed when I was preparing for this sermon after I named it that there was a movie that came out a while back called Holy Moses, but they spelled it with a W-H-O-L-L-Y. And I didn't have time to watch the movie. I think I saw it and it was a comedy. Is that right? It has absolutely nothing to do with the sermon. So don't be confused any more than I've already confused you. I want to speak about Moses primarily because I knew that the kids were going to speak about Moses. They were going to make the presentation, and so I wanted to be in sync with them. And then I began to think of all the reasons why Moses is such an exciting thing to deal with, and it's an exciting subject and person. So I think the main question I want to ask, now I don't hear myself at all. Anybody else? Can you?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay.
You were a little too hot
It's
earlier,
good?
so I turned
Okay.
it down.
Thank you. I'm glad you did. So, much better, yeah. Not quite so hot. Moses has something to do, I believe, with us. And I think that that's an important thing to consider, because otherwise, why be here and listen to me talk about him, right? So who was Moses, and so what? What difference does it make? Well, they've made a lot of movies about Moses, and I think some of them have been in some ways good, and in some ways not so good. I've probably seen most of them, if not all. But Moses in the Bible, he plays a huge role in the Bible. In fact, he's mentioned over 800 times in the Bible. He's mentioned in the Old Testament, of course. That's his main book of residence, but he also finds his way most assuredly into the New Testament, and is mentioned there many times. Moses was a great leader, but he was a reluctant leader. He's not somebody that really wanted the job. And so that is important to consider, because a lot of times there's a job that needs to be done that we don't want to do. Have you ever noticed that in life? There's something, some nagging thing like this person needs $20 and, gee, I need to give that to Jeff. But nonetheless, she came through. I think a part of Christian service, faithful service, is doing things that are not always easy and not always something that we would automatically want to do. He was a reluctant leader, and I'm going to talk about some of the scriptures behind that. He was slow of speech. I want to talk about that some. He was sometimes impatient and sometimes depressed, sometimes almost suicidal. And he was prone to angry responses. And maybe some of us get angry. Is that possible? No? Not on this side of the room. So I want us to look at Exodus 3, 10 through 12. If we can get that up there, okay? And this is from the main book about the activity of Moses, in my mind, Exodus. Yahweh, which is the revealed name to Moses of God, Yahweh, and you spell it, in our language, you would spell it actually Y-H-W-H. And they didn't believe in consonants yet. They hadn't really caught on to all that. But they did. Yahweh said, "Now go to the king. I am sending you to lead my people out of his country." So there's the challenge. There's the call. Moses immediately responds. He says, "Well, who am I to go to the king and lead your people out of Israel, or out of Egypt?" Whoops. And God replies, "I will be with you." Now, I just find that interesting. The first commandment, God says, "Go do this." And Moses says, "Well," and he does that more than once. Let's go over to the next one in Exodus 4. It is an important thing that God mentions, Yahweh mentions, "I will be with you." That is so important to know when you want to step out and do something for God that God will be with you. Otherwise, forget about it. Okay, in Exodus 4:10 through 14, Moses replies to God's call. He says, I have never been a good speaker. I wasn't one before you spoke to me, and I'm not one now. I'm slow at speaking. I can never think of what to say. So, excuses. But the Lord answered, who makes people able to speak or makes them deaf or unable to speak? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Don't you know that I'm the one who does these things? Now go. When you speak, I will be with you and give you the words to say. So, okay, that's a great answer. He's answered his objection. And so Moses, what does he do? Well, he says, Lord, please send someone else to do it. Now the Lord becomes a little angry, just as angry, with Moses and says, what about your brother Aaron the Levite? I know he is a good speaker. So I find the reluctance is very strong there. He doesn't think he is really up to the task. And there are a lot of times, we don't feel like we are up to the task that is before us. I think this slowness of speech was a fairly legitimate objection, and I want to talk about that a little bit in a minute. But in spite of these objections and this reluctance, somehow Moses puts one foot in front of the other and leads. Somehow he leads, but not without strife. When you say yes to God, don't expect that now that you've agreed that everything is going to be smooth and, it'll all be just a wonderful free skate. It's not going to be that way. We go over to Exodus 16, 2 through 4. And there we read, the whole congregation of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. Okay, so they've gotten them out of Egypt. That's a big deal. I'm going to let you off the hook for all that. But they're out there and they've gotten into the wilderness, and now what happens? They're complaining. The Israelites are complaining. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill the whole assembly with hunger. Then the Lord said to Moses, I am going to rain bread from heaven for you, and each day the people shall go out and gather enough for that day. And that's where the manna from heaven comes in. They need something to eat. God provides this miraculous falling of some kind of matter. Nobody knew what to call it, so they called it, what is it? And that's what manna is supposed to mean. What is it? What is this stuff? Mystery meat. And we've probably eaten some mystery meat along the way, too. So they're going along there for a while, and, they finally get tired of eating manna, and they complain about that, too. Moses does not take any of this lightly. Jack Wellman wrote in his Christian Crier blog about what he calls Moses' death wish. He says, make no mistake about it, Moses had carried a heavy burden with a complaining, grumbling nation, where he finally said in Numbers 11, where am I to get meat to give to all this people? For they weep before me and say, give us meat that we may eat. I am not able to carry all this people alone. The burden is too heavy for me. If you will treat me like this, kill me at once, if I find favor in your sight, that I may not see my wretchedness. So he is really down and low. He is feeling terrible. He doesn't want to live any longer if he has to keep dragging these people along. And listen to the complaints. And I'm sure some of them may have amounted to threats. Moses must have felt like he was carrying the nation of Israel on his back, and he finally had enough. However, Moses was strengthened in his time of need when God gave him the advice to find some help among the elders of Israel to help him deal with the people. He finally accessed the people, the helpful people around him. That's important to remember too. If you see a good thing that needs to be done, it doesn't have to be done completely by you. That's why we have in our tradition, why we have a church, a congregation, because we recognize that we may have good ideas and good intentions, but we need to band together to accomplish things. And in this situation, Moses was helped by the elders of Israel. And they got the job done. It was hard for Israel to be led. They had a lot of resistance. They were human, like us. We've resisted leadership too, all of us, we saw it here during the children's message. Everybody stand up, and most of them laid down. It was perfect. Perfect. I couldn't ask for better. It was hard for them, and it was also hard for Moses. And one thing that's occurred to me, one little piece of the puzzle that I had never really thought about, by the time that they get ready to leave Egypt, they are very, very Egyptian. I mean, they are thoroughly, it's been years and years, and they've been there. And, Joseph went down. He's the first one to go down there because his brothers couldn't stand him, so they sold him into slavery. And he winds up down there. He becomes a leader in Egypt, a very important leader, and in a time of famine. And so he becomes, I'm sure, very Egyptian, although he believed in God, and he didn't believe in the many gods of Egypt. And then the people that came along afterwards, the rest of the Israelites that came along, they were all becoming more and more Egyptian by the time that we get to this story. They've been there for decades, and we went to Seattle a few weeks back, Raylene and I, and we were there about, less than a week, and we were kind of getting in the swing of what it's like to be a Seattle person, and that's just the way we are. We adapt to the situation that we find ourselves in. And so when somebody says, we want to get you out of here and take you somewhere that you don't know anything about, and everything that you are used to, you're going to leave all that behind. Just imagine how you'd feel about that. The great unknown. It's kind of like sending somebody to Mars nowadays. They talk about it, but who wants to go? Anybody? We're not getting up a load right now, but we'll get back to you. We often prefer the devil we know to the one we don't know. Things may be terrible, but at least we're used to it. An example of how Egyptian they had become is that when Moses is up on the mountain getting the law, when he comes back down with the law, what are they doing? They're worshiping the golden calf. Very Egyptian. That is a very Egyptian way to go at it. And Moses was not happy about that. But he grew up in the royal court himself, the Egyptian royal court. And there are some things about him that I'm sure were extremely Egyptian. He didn't have any Old Testament to read. There was no Old Testament yet. He didn't have any law of Moses. That hadn't happened yet. He carried around this staff that had a snake on it. That sounds very Egyptian to me. Maybe it's just me. But he had this task of leading his people out of their past, out of their Egyptian past, and into a future that was totally, totally unknown and scary. And I'm sure in some ways that sounded very repulsive. Getting out there where you don't have any food, you don't have any water, and what's going to come next? We tend to be bound by our past also. The past is important because it got us here, but we can't live in the past. That's what they were hoping to do. And I found that in serving churches through the years. Some of the churches I've served have been bound to the past. They have this story that they love to tell about how wonderful everything used to be. And if you are the current minister of a church and they keep telling you how great everything was, and I wanted to ask people, I'd say, that was back before God died in the 60s, right? I mean, it kind of amounts to that, if we act like everything can't be great now and isn't great now, then we kind of infer that God isn't alive anymore. Do we believe that? I don't believe that. I think God's with us, and we have as much potential as ever. So, anyway, I never did actually ask the question. This is the first time I've revealed it in church. So I wanted to say, yeah, that's before God died, right? It's kind of sarcastic, isn't it? So anyway, Moses was more Egyptian than we think. The Israelites are more Egyptian than we tend to think. Another thing about Moses, he had apparently an Egyptian name. Now there's a story about how he got his name, but a lot of scholars nowadays are saying that really his name Moses is just like a couple of pharaohs. There was Tutmos. That ending of that is the same as Moses. And then Ramses, the ending of that is the same as Moses. So it's like he has an Egyptian name with the Egyptian god lopped off the front of it. And what the Moses means is child of. So his name is child of. Child of who? It's a mystery. Who do you think? Well, I think he became a child of Yahweh as time went on. But they called him a kind of a funny name. Dr. Ogden Gellett said, the history of Israel begins with this enslavement in Egypt. That's a funny place to begin your history in enslavement. Israel is defined in opposition to everything Egyptian. They're powerful, Israel's weak. They are rich, Israel's poor. They have many gods, Israel has one. Isn't it ironic then that the greatest Hebrew prophet and lawgiver, the man who single-handedly organized the Israelites and led them out of Egypt, he has an Egyptian name? And his name is not just any Egyptian name, it's a religious Egyptian name. Moses' name reflects basic Egyptian religious beliefs that are in truth not different from Mosaic Judaism as the book of Exodus might lead us to believe. Since Pharaoh's daughter named him, some scholars hold that the name Moses was more likely from an Egyptian root, MSS, in our letters, meaning child of, as in Tutmos or Ramses, which means Ramses is child of Ra or Re, and Tutmos is child of Tot. Those are two Egyptian gods. He grew up in the Egyptian palace. Quite possibly he's influenced by a controversial pharaoh that Egyptian history wanted to forget about and write out of existence, Pharaoh Akhenaten. And in fact, Ahmed Osman has an interesting theory about Akhenaten and Moses, so I might get around to talking to on Wednesday night, which I find fascinating. Moses married two women, and none of them sound Hebrew. He led Egypt out, but Moses didn't get to lead him into the promised land. So it's like his connection to Egypt may be limited to him to where he couldn't go all the way to the goal with them. He led them to that promised land, but then he perished before he could lead them into it. So Moses, a fascinating character. A lot more like you and me than we tend to think. And this business about being holy, in my mind, the biblical concept of holy is God has something to do. He has something that needs to be done. And he says to somebody like Moses, he says, go do that. And you are dedicated to doing that task. And that's what holy is. God says, you're the people to do that. It's not that you're perfect or anything, but it's that God wants to use you and use me to accomplish his will and to love the world as he loves the world. So Moses led his people out of the past and into the future, and that's what we are going through now. Our leaders are leading us out of the past and into the future. And the funny thing about the future, when you get there, what's it going to be? It's going to be the present, right? Yeah. And that's where we are right now. We're in the present. When we get to the future, it won't be called the future anymore. It'll be the present. Well, one thing we can be sure of, whether it's the past, the present, or the future, God will be with us as God was with Moses. And I say this in the name of Jesus. Amen.